At the height of the London season, when reputations were weighed as delicately as silk and ruined just as easily, the chandeliers of Almack's assembly rooms burned with merciless clarity. Their light spilled across polished floors, gilded cornices, and the ranks of watching faces that had come not merely to dance, but to judge. Every movement was observed, every pause interpreted, and every silence endowed with meaning. It was here, beneath those glittering lights and within that unforgiving circle of society, that a young lady's dignity would be tested in a moment so brief it might have passed unnoticed, had it not cut so deeply. Miss Eleanor Ashcombe stood near the edge of the ballroom, her gloved hands folded with careful composure, her posture a study in restraint. She was not the most dazzling presence in the room, nor did she wish to be. Her beauty was of a quieter sort, refined by intelligence and softened by reserve, the kind that revealed itself only to those who looked twice. Raised to value discretion above display, Eleanor had learned early that in a world governed by rank and patronage, a woman's greatest armor was self-command. Yet even armor, she would soon learn, could be pierced. Across the room moved His Grace, Alexander Montford, Duke of Rathbury, newly returned from the Peninsula campaigns and still carrying the faint bearing of the battlefield in his stride. He was a man admired for his lineage, his fortune, and his service to the crown, a figure whose presence drew attention as inevitably as a magnet draws steel. London had welcomed him back with enthusiasm, eager to reclaim one of its most eligible sons and to test whether war had sharpened or softened him. To Alexander, Almack's represented not romance, but strategy, a place where alliances were formed with a nod, and futures determined with a single dance. When their paths converged, it was not by accident. Introductions had been made, discreetly and with hope, by a well-meaning intermediary who believed that good sense might yet prevail over rigid hierarchies. Eleanor inclined her head, her expression open but guarded, and extended her hand in accordance with custom. The music had begun to rise, and for one suspended instant the world seemed to wait upon his response. Alexander, assessing her with a glance too swift and too practiced, hesitated only a fraction of a second before offering a courteous bow and a quiet refusal. "I am engaged for this set," he said, his tone impeccably polite, his words devastating in their finality. The refusal itself was not unprecedented. Almack's thrived on exclusion. Yet it was the manner, the timing, and the witnesses that transformed it into something sharper. Eleanor withdrew her hand without comment, her face betraying nothing, though a warmth crept painfully along her cheeks. Around them, conversations faltered. Fans paused mid-flicker. A glance passed from one matron to another, and then another, until the moment had been silently catalogued and stored away for later repetition. Eleanor did not flee the room, nor did she seek consolation. She remained where she was, bearing the weight of scrutiny with admirable stillness, aware that any sign of distress would be seized upon and magnified. To leave would be to confirm the slight, to stay was to endure it. She chose endurance. Yet beneath that composed exterior, a quiet reckoning took place. She understood, with painful clarity, that she had not been rejected for want of grace or intellect, but for want of influence. Her family, respectable though it was, lacked the crucial endorsement of the Whig patronesses who ruled Almack's with an authority even dukes rarely challenged. Alexander, meanwhile, moved on without immediate regret, accepting the hand of another with ease and resuming his place within the social current. To him, the refusal was a necessary calculation, a means of preserving favor in a room where alliances mattered more than sentiment. He did not see Eleanor watching from the periphery, nor did he hear the whispers that followed in his wake, subtle at first, then increasingly pointed. What he failed to grasp was that Almack's was not merely a ballroom, but a tribunal, and that even a duke could misjudge its verdicts. By the evening's end, the incident had acquired a life of its own. Carriages carried it into the streets, servants repeated it below stairs, and by morning it would be dissected over breakfast tables from Mayfair to St. James's. Eleanor returned home with her mother, the silence between them heavy but respectful. No reproach was spoken, for none was needed. Both women understood the precariousness of their position, and the cruel efficiency with which society enforced its hierarchies. Yet what neither Eleanor nor Alexander could have known, as that night closed and the chandeliers dimmed, was how swiftly fortune was preparing to rearrange itself. For Eleanor, a long-delayed presentation at court loomed quietly on the horizon, its significance unguessed by those who had dismissed her. For Alexander, the refusal he considered trivial would soon echo back to him with consequences far beyond embarrassment. Pride had spoken in a moment of calculation, but it had done so in the hearing of a society that never forgot, and rarely forgave, without exacting a price. The night ended as all such nights did, with music fading into memory and judgments hardening into fact, yet something intangible lingered in the air, an unease not easily named. Eleanor lay awake long after returning home, replaying the scene not in bitterness, but in sober reflection, determined that humiliation would not define her. Alexander, in contrast, slept soundly, unaware that the very composure he prized had masked a cruelty he would soon be forced to confront. Between them stretched the vast machinery of society, already turning, already whispering, already preparing to demand from both a reckoning neither yet imagined, but which the coming days would make unavoidable in ways that would test pride, patience, and the fragile mercy of public forgiveness itself entirely. Morning revealed what the night before had merely suggested, that a single refusal at Almack's could ripple outward until it disturbed the whole surface of London society. By breakfast, Eleanor Ashcombe's name had been spoken in drawing-rooms she had never entered, weighed and assessed by voices that knew her only through conjecture. Some pitied her, others dismissed her, but all agreed the slight had been deliberate, and deliberate slights were never accidental. Eleanor received these reports with outward calm, though each retelling pressed the memory more firmly into her mind, not as a wound to be indulged, but as a fact to be acknowledged. She did not alter her habits or retreat from view. She continued her calls, attended small musicales, and answered inquiries with measured civility. This composure, though born of necessity, lent her an unexpected distinction. Those who observed her closely remarked upon it, noting that she neither solicited sympathy nor displayed resentment. Her restraint was interpreted variously as pride or resignation, yet it preserved her dignity in a way open indignation never could. Eleanor understood that in a society governed by appearances, endurance was itself a form of quiet defiance. Alexander Montfort, meanwhile, found the atmosphere subtly altered. At White's and Brooks's, where his presence had once commanded effortless respect, conversations now paused a fraction longer when he entered. Remarks were phrased with careful neutrality, questions asked with faintly sharpened curiosity. He sensed, without fully understanding, that something had shifted. The refusal at Almack's returned to him, not as a moral failing, but as a miscalculation. He had underestimated the significance of a woman he assumed inconsequential, and in doing so had revealed a lapse in judgment society was quick to exploit. The realization struck more forcefully when a mutual acquaintance, less tactful than most, remarked upon Miss Ashcombe's impending presentation at St. James's. Alexander listened in silence as the details emerged, each one dismantling his earlier assumptions. A royal connection, distant yet legitimate, had been quietly secured, promising Eleanor an entree into circles he had thought closed to her. What had seemed an inconsequential refusal now threatened to become an affront remembered by those whose favor he required. Pride gave way to unease, and unease soon sharpened into regret. Regret alone, however, was insufficient. Alexander had been shaped by a world that valued action over introspection, and he resolved to correct his error in the manner most readily available to him. The first delivery arrived at Ashcombe House shortly after dawn, a carriage laden with roses so fresh they still held the chill of morning. Eleanor's mother received the card in silence, recognizing the name at once. Eleanor herself stood back, observing as servants carried the blooms inside, their fragrance filling rooms usually marked by restraint. The gesture was not discreet. Neighbors took notice, pausing in the street to count the arrangements and speculate upon their origin. By the second day, the number had doubled, and by the third, wagons arrived in steady procession, each bearing more roses than the last. 7,000 blooms a day, it was said, sourced from Covent Garden and private hothouses along the Thames, paid for without negotiation. London, ever eager for spectacle, seized upon the display with enthusiasm bordering on delight. Eleanor neither acknowledged nor returned the gifts. She ordered them distributed to churches and hospitals, refusing to allow her home to become a shrine to public penitence. This refusal, quiet and absolute, intrigued observers more than acceptance ever could have done. It suggested a woman unwilling to be purchased by extravagance, and in doing so subtly shifted the narrative. The roses, intended as an assertion of devotion, became instead a measure of the distance Alexander had yet to cross. For Alexander, the effect was chastening. Each unanswered gesture forced him to confront the inadequacy of wealth when set against wounded pride. He had believed spectacle sufficient to erase insult, only to discover that true amends required more than abundance. The roses continued nonetheless, driven by equal parts stubbornness and hope, until even his friends urged moderation. He persisted, understanding dimly that retreat would confirm failure, while persistence at least demonstrated resolve. As the days passed, society watched with rapt attention. Some praised the Duke's perseverance, others mocked it as excessive, yet all agreed the affair had transcended mere flirtation. Eleanor's silence lent her an authority she had never sought, while Alexander's visible contrition exposed a vulnerability previously unseen. The balance between them shifted imperceptibly, yet decisively. What had begun as humiliation evolved into a contest of dignity and remorse, played out before an audience incapable of indifference. On the 7th morning, as another procession of roses arrived, Eleanor paused beside an open window and breathed in their fragrance, her expression unreadable. She did not soften, but neither did she harden further. Somewhere between irritation and contemplation, a question took shape, not of forgiveness, but of intention. Alexander, she understood, was no longer acting for convenience alone. Whether that realization would alter her resolve remained uncertain, but for the first time since Almack's, the future seemed unsettled rather than closed, and that uncertainty, fragile and dangerous, was enough to keep the story from its end. The request for a private meeting arrived without ornament, conveyed through proper channels and framed in language so restrained it allowed no speculation. Eleanor read it once, then again, weighing not the words but the courage required to send them. She understood at once what accepting would imply, and equally what refusal would communicate. To decline would be safe, decisive, and applauded by those who valued consistency over compassion. To agree would invite scrutiny, and perhaps disappointment. After a long interval, she folded the paper carefully and consented, not out of indulgence, but because silence had exhausted its usefulness. They met at a late afternoon hour chosen to avoid observation, in a quiet drawing-room lent by a mutual acquaintance whose discretion was beyond question. The light was subdued, filtered through tall windows where rain traced narrow paths down the glass. A fire burned low in the grate, casting a steady glow that softened the room's edges without banishing its shadows. Eleanor arrived first and stood for a moment before sitting, her gloves still on, her posture erect. She did not rehearse her thoughts. Whatever was to be said, she resolved, would be spoken plainly. Alexander entered without ceremony, his usual confidence tempered by a gravity that slowed his step. He bowed deeply, not as a gesture of rank, but of respect, and remained standing until she inclined her head in acknowledgment. For an instant neither spoke. The silence between them was not awkward, but heavy, filled with what had already passed and what could not be undone. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and deliberate, as though each word had been tested before release. "I asked for this meeting," he began, "because there are matters that cannot be addressed with flowers, nor repaired by public display." He paused, meeting her gaze steadily. "I wronged you, not by refusing a dance, but by failing to see you as deserving of consideration." Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression composed yet intent. She had anticipated apology, but not the absence of excuse. That restraint unsettled her more than defensiveness would have done. When she spoke, it was with measured calm. "You are correct in one respect," she said. The refusal itself was unremarkable. It was the manner, and the audience, that rendered it cruel. Alexander inclined his head, accepting the rebuke without protest. "I allowed convenience to masquerade as judgment," he replied. "In doing so, I revealed a failure of character I have been slow to recognize, and slower still to correct." The admission cost him visibly. Eleanor observed the tension in his hands, the controlled cadence of his speech, and understood that this was not a performance rehearsed for effect. It was an exposure he would never permit elsewhere. That knowledge did not absolve him, but it altered the shape of her resentment. She felt, for the first time since Almack's, the faint stirrings of pity, swiftly checked by caution. "You have corrected nothing yet," she said quietly. "You have demonstrated regret, but regret does not restore dignity once it has been publicly diminished." Alexander met her words with a steady seriousness. "Then tell me what would," he said, not as a challenge, but as a request. The question lingered between them, heavy with implication. Eleanor turned her gaze briefly toward the window, watching rain blur the outlines of the street beyond. When she looked back, her voice remained even, though something resolute had settled behind it. "I will not be consoled in private for an injury sustained in public," she said. "Nor will I accept gestures that invite spectacle without accountability." He considered this, understanding dawning slowly. "You ask that I answer before the same witnesses who observed my failure," he said. "I ask nothing," Eleanor replied. "I state a condition." The distinction mattered. Alexander acknowledged it with a nod, aware that any appeal to sentiment would undermine the respect he sought to reclaim. He drew a breath, as though bracing himself, and spoke again. "If I were to do so," he said, "it would expose me to ridicule, and perhaps to lasting consequence." She regarded him steadily. "As I was exposed," she answered. The symmetry of it struck him with quiet force. In that moment, Alexander understood that forgiveness, if it came at all, would not be an act of generosity, but of justice. He bowed once more deeply than before. "Then I will meet that condition," he said simply. "Not because it will serve me, but because it is owed." The certainty in his tone surprised them both. Eleanor felt the last of her anger loosen, not vanishing, but losing its edge. She had not anticipated resolution, only clarity, and she had been granted that much. When she rose to leave, he did not attempt to detain her. He opened the door himself, standing aside with quiet deference. As Eleanor stepped back into the gray light of the afternoon, she felt neither triumph nor relief, but something more tentative, an awareness that a path had been opened where none had existed before. Behind her, Alexander remained in the dim room, alone with the weight of his promise. Outside, the rain eased, leaving the air cleansed and expectant, as though London itself were holding its breath for what would next be dared, and whether pride, once wounded, might yet learn the discipline of humility before the watching world. Almack's assembly rooms received society once more beneath their familiar chandeliers, though the atmosphere that evening was sharpened by anticipation rather than novelty. The season had begun its slow descent toward conclusion, and with it came a reckoning for those whose reputations still hung unresolved. Eleanor Ashcombe entered on her mother's arm with measured composure, her expression serene, her bearing unchanged by the weeks of scrutiny that had passed. She wore no conspicuous ornament, only the quiet assurance of a woman who had learned that dignity required neither display nor defense. The room, however, was keenly aware of her presence. Conversation softened, then resumed with deliberate casualness, eyes following her progress as though tracing a familiar story nearing its final page. She took her place among the assembled guests without haste, acknowledging greetings with calm courtesy. There was no sign of triumph in her manner, nor any hint of expectation. If she felt the weight of the moment, she carried it inwardly, resolved that whatever occurred would be met on her own terms. Alexander Montfort arrived shortly thereafter, alone, his entrance lacking the usual flourish accorded to his rank. He paused just within the threshold, allowing the scene to settle before him, then advanced with purposeful restraint. Those who knew him well noted the difference at once, the absence of easy confidence, the presence instead of something steadier and more deliberate. He did not survey the room for advantage, but fixed his attention upon Eleanor, and toward her he moved without deviation. When he reached her, he bowed, not perfunctorily, but with unmistakable intention, the gesture drawing notice even among an audience practiced in observation. "Miss Ashcombe," he said clearly, his voice carrying without strain, "may I request the honor of your hand for this set?" The request fell into a silence, so complete it seemed to absorb the music itself. Eleanor did not respond at once. She looked at him, truly looked, as though weighing not the words, but the resolve behind them. In that pause lay every whisper, every rose, every calculated judgment that had preceded this moment. At last, she inclined her head. "You may," she replied, her tone even, her acceptance neither hurried nor withheld. A subtle exhalation passed through the room, as though society itself had been holding breath. Alexander offered his arm, and Eleanor placed her gloved hand upon it with quiet assurance. Together they moved toward the floor, not as a spectacle of conquest or surrender, but as equals engaged in a deliberate act of restoration. The dance began, and with it the unspoken acknowledgment that what had been broken was, at least in part, being mended. They spoke little as they moved, bound by the formalities of the set, yet the absence of words did not diminish the exchange. In the measured steps and respectful distance required by custom, a different conversation unfolded, one of attentiveness and restraint. Alexander matched her pace with care, his focus unwavering, while Eleanor met his attention without hesitation. There was no triumph in her expression, only a calm recognition of what this moment signified. Around them, society recalibrated. Whispers shifted in tone, curiosity yielding to approval, skepticism softening into concession. The patronesses observed closely, noting not merely the dance, but the manner in which it was conducted. Alexander's conduct left no room for ambiguity. This was no casual overture, but a public acknowledgment of esteem, offered without irony or reserve. Eleanor, in accepting, did not relinquish her dignity, but affirmed it. When the set concluded, Alexander did not release her hand at once. He bowed again, less formally this time, and spoke in a voice meant for her alone, though those nearest could not fail to overhear. "Thank you," he said simply, the words carrying a gravity that transformed them into something more than courtesy. Eleanor inclined her head in response. "You are welcome," she answered, and withdrew her hand without haste. They parted then, returning to their respective places, the immediate drama concluded, yet its implications continuing to unfold. Eleanor resumed her seat beside her mother, her posture unchanged, her composure intact. Alexander stood for a moment where she had left him, then turned to acknowledge several acquaintances who approached with newly respectful regard. The balance of regard had shifted, not dramatically, but decisively. As the evening progressed, Eleanor received invitations she might once have anticipated with hope, now accepted with measured discernment. She observed the room with a clarity born of experience, aware that admiration was often contingent and that favor could be fleeting. Yet she no longer felt diminished by that knowledge. She had faced society's judgment and emerged with her sense of self not merely preserved, but strengthened. Alexander, too, felt the change. The ease with which he had once navigated such gatherings was replaced by something more deliberate, yet also more authentic. In meeting Eleanor's condition, he had relinquished a measure of pride, only to discover that what remained was steadier than what he had surrendered. He watched her from a distance, not with possession, but with respect, understanding that whatever lay ahead would be shaped not by entitlement, but by continued regard. As the chandeliers dimmed and carriages were called, the evening drew toward its close without further incident. Yet its significance lingered, carried away in memory and conversation, altering perceptions in ways both subtle and enduring. Eleanor departed with the same quiet dignity with which she had arrived, aware that the season would remember this night not for spectacle, but for its resolution. Alexander remained behind a moment longer, observing the dispersing crowd, then turned toward the door with a measured sense of purpose. Outside, the night air was cool and clear, the streets reflecting lamplight like polished stone. London resumed its familiar rhythm, indifferent yet observant, ready to absorb the outcome into its vast ledger of judgments. Within that ledger, a slight had been answered, not erased, but redeemed through acknowledgment and restraint. And though neither Eleanor nor Alexander could yet name what the future would require of them, both understood that something essential had been set right, not by excess or persuasion, but by a public act of humility that restored dignity where it had once been denied, and in doing so brought their story to a close defined not by injury, but by earned regard.